Armani, Abs, and an Inordinate Amount of Green Slime by OnlyForward. When Clint pranks Peter Parker by leaving green slime all over his room, including all of his clothes except his business suits, Peter is forced to wear an Armani suit into school for the day. Cue Midtown collectively being like, what the fuck? Because when did Peter get abs?
And how does the boy look so hot in a suit?
Peter Parker woke up one morning to an absolute tragedy. Well, his definition of tragedy varied immensely, but in this case, it was a prank-related tragedy. In fact, it was an Avengers prank-related tragedy, which tended to supersede most mundane pranks teenagers were exposed to. No, the Avengers took pranking seriously. He and Tony, for example, had recently waged war on Steve and Bucky, who had bribed T'Challa to get one of the Wakandan tech specialists to hack into Friday, so she would start calling Tony Mr. Stink and Peter Spider Baby instead of their respective titles. They, being idiots, hadn't considered the ramifications of the fact that Peter actually worked at Stark Industries, and every time he would enter the building, his secret superhero identity would be revealed to his colleagues, who were blissfully unaware that Peter was their resident neighborhood hero as well as being the heir to the company. Luckily, Friday, being as intelligent as she was for an AI, had been able to interrupt Peter before he went through the security scanner, so his identity hadn't been revealed to any of his colleagues. Tony had wanted to have a strongly worded conversation to Steve and Bucky about how far pranks could go. Peter suspected he was a little upset that he had gone to the board meeting Pepper had forced him to go to. The whole board had laughed when Friday had given him an announcement, which started with calling him Mr. Stink. But Peter had proposed, instead, retaliation. Steve Rogers loved cooking, a common known fact amongst the Avengers. It was his pride and joy, being able to cook them a good meal, and in the compound there were always an array of ingredients in the fridge and cupboards to keep Steve happy. So Peter had had the genius plan of mixing everything up in the kitchen to get on Steve's nerves, relabeling the salt to be the sugar, making the tap spill lemonade instead of water, moving the bowls and trays somewhere he couldn't find them. Stupid things that would grate on his nerves. Tony had thought it was hilarious. But anyways, that wasn't linked to the tragedy that Peter Parker woke up to. No, it was linked to subsection C of the Avengers prank war, Peter Parker versus Clint Barton, an ongoing battle. After Peter had suggested to Steve to put up invisible webbing in Clint's vents that one time Steve had called him, whilst Peter was in calculus, Clint had been on the warpath in an attempt to get back at Peter. Apparently, that took the form of leaving green slime all over his room in the tower on a random Wednesday morning. Peter climbed out of bed to examine the problem in more depth and instantly plummeted his hand into slime that was on his duvet. Really, Clint? Shit, Peter said with his slimy hands on his hips, standing on the one bit of his floor that wasn't coated in slime. All of his clothes, naturally, were covered in the substance, and Peter did mean all of his clothes, because hell, he was a teenager. You couldn't fault him for not putting away his clothes in drawers and simply draping them across chairs, surfaces, and even on the floor when he got bored. His cupboards were tragically bereft of clothes as a result, because Peter had flung every item of clothing he owned on the floor when he had tried to figure out what he was wearing the day previous. And now all of them were covered in slime. Right, Peter sighed, then jumped on the ceiling. It was really the only way he was going to be able to move around without trotting in the green goop. What was he going to wear to school? Peter checked his cupboards, upside down, just to be sure, but yup, they were empty. He was officially out of any wearable clothing. Huh. Peter pondered it for a moment, considering just going in pajamas or buying new clothes. Then he had a brainwave. He sped down to his office and flung the door open in triumph. Because he did, after all, have some clothes. Most of them were being dry cleaned, but there was one suit he had left in his office cupboard for work. The blazer and trousers were blue, tailored to fit him exactly, and it was one of Peter's favorite suits from when he was in meetings. Comfortable enough, but also stylish. Peter winced at the fact that he'd have to wear it to Midtown and vowed to get Clint back good when he had time to. He took a deep breath, then got changed into the suit, knowing he'd have to deal with the ramifications of walking into Midtown High School not wearing a nerd shirt, but instead a suit. Flash, at least, would say something, but Peter was enough of a nobody most of the time that not many people took notice, so he'd figured he'd get through the day unscathed. Nice outfit, Happy said with a raised eyebrow when Peter climbed in the car for Happy to drop him off in the morning. Don't ask, Peter said, rolling his eyes, toast in hand. His schedule had been fucked up because of the slime incident, so it was a breakfast in the car kind of morning. It was this or slime-covered pajamas. About 10 minutes passed, in which time Peter ate his toast, had a crucially important conversation with the secretary to the Queen of England about their clean energy contract, and had also managed to plan a rough sketch for his retaliatory prank. They pulled up to Midtown High, and Happy turned to him as he stopped. "Have a good day," Happy said, clearly still bemused over the fact that Peter was wearing a suit to school. And a nice one, too, at that. Tony would have keeled over if his heir had worn budget suits, Peter knew. He was part of the Stark legacy. He'd have to have quality tailored suits. "Thanks, Happy," Peter nodded and jumped out. He smoothed down his suit and jostled the backpack to sit on one of his shoulders comfortably, then took a deep breath in and strode toward the school. Several people stared. Some even pointed, which was rather rude, but Peter ignored them. Just some freshmen who didn't know better, didn't know how to act normal. "Dude," Ned hissed as he approached Peter in the corridor, looking alarmed at Peter's choice of clothing for the day. "You do realize this is Midtown, right? As in, the high school?" Ouch. Peter was fairly unaware of dates, but did Ned really think he'd mix up school with work badly enough to accidentally wear a suit to school? "I know, Ned," Peter said patiently. "Clint put green slime all over my room last night. Or early this morning. I'm honestly not sure. This is the result." "Cool," Ned whispered back, dragging the syllable out. "No, Ned, not cool," Peter gestured to himself. "I have to wear this to school because I literally have no other clothes." "You really had nothing else?" Ned asked, with a raised eyebrow. "They got all covered in the slime," Peter said, "except the suit." "Your life, man," Ned grinned, a common phrase of Ned's for when Peter said anything that was remotely concerning. Homeroom was boring, and he and Ned had just spent it talking about the prank Peter was planning on doing in response to the slime incident. Then Peter separated from Ned and went to his first lesson, Spanish, with Señora Garcia, without thinking too much about the fact that he was wearing a suit. Señora Garcia hadn't seemed too alarmed at his choice of outfit, but then again, she was a bit like Professor Trinlottie in the way that they both seemed to space out, so Peter wasn't even entirely sure she noticed. He sat down in his seat and then frowned. It was kind of warm with the jacket on, and he never really liked wearing jackets too much anyways when he's busy doing stuff. Most of the time at Stark Industries, Peter normally just wore a shirt, leaving the jacket draped over some other surface. So he slid the suit jacket off and placed it on his chair to rest. Then he was able to stretch out and be a little bit more relaxed, almost as if he was wearing his usual hoodie. Flash Thompson, resident bully and popular kid extraordinaire, sat behind him in calculus, which was just such Parker luck it was unbelievable. As the boy entered, he stopped in the doorway as he locked eyes on Peter, mouth slowly falling open in shock. Señora Garcia tutted at him for holding up the line, so he slowly walked to sit behind Peter. When he sat, he made an incomprehensible noise that sounded something like what a key smash would be like if it was vocalized. Or at least, that was what Peter thought it would sound like. "Parker?" Flash whispered to him. His voice was slightly higher pitched than normal. Is that Armani?" Peter turned around to look at the boy with raised eyebrows, then looked down at the suit jacket he draped across the back of his chair with a small amount of amusement. He folded over the collar to check the label and, right, of course, Tony had bought him an Armani suit. That was just so typical of him. "Huh," Peter shrugged as though it was nothing. "I guess it is." He didn't really care about labels and shit like that, but clearly Flash did because he made the key smash noise again, but didn't seem as though he was capable of communicating further, so Peter turned back around to focus on his Spanish. Not that he really needed to, of course. After he'd spent some time negotiating a deal with the Spanish government, UN business, Peter was pretty much fluent in Spanish. He had a talent for languages, after all, and had picked up Russian pretty quickly once he had Bucky and Nat to teach him. After that, his day proceeded pretty much as normal. Spanish to calculus, calculus to A-push, etc. He carried his jacket alongside his backpack, but didn't put it back on. The day was too hot, and it just got in his way. At lunch, he eagerly queued up to get his food, wondering if he could convince the lunch lady to give him an extra large portion, and then chickened out of asking. She was nice, but he didn't want to push it. Then, after he'd gotten his food and was collecting his knife and fork, back turned to the rest of the hole, someone tapped him on the shoulder and didn't wait for him to turn around and start speaking. "Sir, you'll need to get a visitor's pass, I'm afraid. We can't allow unauthorized adults on the premise," the receptionist explained. He turned around, lunch tray in hand, and said confused, I'm a student?" Her eyes had widened when she recognized him, and she looked horrified. "Oh, Peter, I'm so sorry." No worries, Peter smiled at her, an attempt to put her at ease. It was only a mistake, she was just doing her jobs. Most kids, after all, didn't turn up wearing a suit. He was the one in the wrong in that sense. I'm gonna go eat my lunch now? She nodded, looking embarrassed, and like she wanted to apologize profusely. So Peter quickly left and found himself an empty table to wait for Ned, who had texted him saying he'd be a bit late because he had to talk to his teacher about some homework or something. Ned rushed towards him when he reached the lunch hall, looking concerned. Peter frowned. Peter, you do realize that everyone can see your abs through that shirt, right? Ned whispered in panic mode when he was close enough that only Peter would hear. What? Peter looked up at Ned, alarmed. Yeah, Ned said, sliding along to sit next to him. I just heard Cindy and Betty theorizing you're secretly on steroids. Peter blinked, couldn't say anything in response. Because, what the fuck? Steroids? Had they met him? Oh, that's nothing, MJ said, appearing out of nowhere. She was completely straight-faced and said her next sentence entirely calmly. Jason Ionella said you looked hot just now. Both Ned and Peter swiveled around to her immediately and echoed the same response. What? Peter shook his head, unbelieving. Jason Ionello, resident jock and the guy who was like 100% straight, had just called him, Peter Parker the nerd, hot? In what world? Please elaborate, Ned begged, and Peter just shook his head, face red. He didn't want any more details. MJ shrugged. I don't have anything further, just that. What the fuck? Peter said and looked down at his shirt. Okay, so maybe it was just a little see-through because it was white, but he never had that kind of reaction before when he'd taken off his jacket in the R&D labs. He swallowed his food uncomfortably and subtly cast a glance around the room and met with most of the people in the lunch hall staring at him. Peter returned his gaze to his food, sure that his face turned a shade redder than it had before. Okay, he hadn't realized that people had been staring. That was on him, and damn, he was supposed to have, like, super senses, too. Peter had really thought he would get away with it without being noticed too much. After that, Peter paid a little more attention to what was happening around him. He saw firsthand as one of the popular girl's mouths dropped open as he walked by, and Peter subsequently crossed his arms in front of his chest to stop his traitor abs from showing, and making people have reactions like that. Stupid enhanced powers giving it abs. Apparently, though, that just made it worse. Because, of course, when Peter crossed his arms, it meant he flexed his biceps, and one of the juniors literally fainted at the sight of it. Peter rushed out to catch her, and then she'd fainted again when she woke up in his arms. Then promptly woke up and asked him out. Peter spent the rest of his afternoon perpetually in shock because, and he couldn't stress this enough, what the fuck? Was his whole school really thirsting over him because he was wearing a tailored shirt? Peter rolled up his sleeves. Again, it was a hot day in order to do a biology lab, and there had been actual genuine gasps from Cindy and Betty, who sat 3 rows behind him. Ned and MJ found that entirely hilarious, but Peter had just wanted the sweet release of death to kindly take him away. He got asked out by 3 separate individuals, including the girl who had fainted. One of them, to Peter's shock, being the jock and his apparently not straight classmate Jason Ionello, who seemed to be having a breakdown as he stared at Peter's abs. Jason looks like he's having his gay awakening, MJ commented to Ned as Peter rejected the popular boy advances. Peter shot her a glare, having heard it with his enhanced hearing. After Peter had cleansed his mind of the entire interaction, he finished all his remaining lessons, though they hadn't been that productive as most of his classmates seemed incapable of answering questions for some reason. It had been, to summarize in one entirely inadequate phrase, a terrible day. He walked to Happy's car like he had been through a battle, and it felt like he had. Peter ignored the stares and the wolf whistles as he opened the car door and flipped off the remainder of his classmates, entirely done with the day and all of its bullshit. Oh, you good, kid? Happy said as Peter collapsed into the passenger seat and shut the door, hiding himself from view. He melted into the seat, sliding down below the seatbelt. Peter groaned. No, I don't want to talk about it. On the journey back to the tower, they sat in silence. Okay, no, that was a lie. Happy put Hamilton on the radio, and Peter could never say no to rapping Hamilton, no matter how depressed he was. He rapped to the room where it happens, doing all the parts to the best of his abilities, and Peter's ability was elite level when it came to Hamilton. Some would say God tier. Peter was wholly convinced he could do a one-man show of Hamilton and win an Oscar for it. Wednesday afternoon was lab time, so Peter got into the elevator up to Tony's lab when they reached Stark Industries. Even better, he was only stopped by 3 colleagues on his way there. He had hardly been waylaid at all. One had been complimenting his suit, which had reminded Peter so much of his day at school that he wanted to burst into tears. One had asked him to sign a form, and another asked for some help in the lab. Peter had patiently turned down the last one because he technically wasn't working. Wednesday, after all, was his day off. He could understand why the intern was confused, though. Peter only wore a suit when he was at work. Peter wearing it was normally a good indication to approach and demand things of him. But Peter had no interest in explaining that an Avenger had covered all his clothes in green slime. So he simply dismissed himself with a wave and promised he would help the intern as soon as he could. And then Peter got on the elevator to go up to Tony's lab. "Hey, Pete," Tony waved as he entered the lab, looking up from whatever he was working on and immediately looking back down again. It was for the best, Peter realized, because he seemed to be soldering things together, and that was pretty important to pay attention to. "How was school?" Then he paused, looking back at Peter properly and blinking, nearly burning himself on the soldering tool. "Wait, why are you wearing the Armani?" "Tony," Peter said, feeling and probably looking entirely shaken. He ignored the last comment and went into complaining mode. "I just had the worst day at school ever." Tony put down the soldering kit without hesitation. "What?" Tony jumped up. "What happened? Was it Marita again? Because if that little son of a bitch tried anything—" "No, it wasn't the principal. It was everyone else," Peter muttered, pained. "What did they do?" Tony asked, still seemingly confused. He seemed like he was trying to reach for a repulsor, his hand flexing, but he kept himself back. Peter made direct eye contact with his mentor, giving off what he hoped was a haunted look. "Tony," he said slowly, sincerely, "they kept thirsting over me." Tony blinked, entirely frozen in his position. It seemed like Peter had broken his mentor with the declaration. He choked out a response, higher pitched than normal. What? "They kept calling me hot, Tony, I swear to God," Peter panicked, running his hands through his hair. 3 people asked me out. 3! One of them being Jason, Nello. I don't think I can ever go back." "Oh my God," Tony said, and collapsed back on his lab stool. He put one hand over his face. "I don't think I know how to process this," he said, but it was muffled from behind his hand. "Neither do I," Peter said, still stood in the entrance to the lab, entirely in shock and confusion. "I'm supposed to be the nerd, not, he sputtered, trying to find the right word. "Some piece of ass?" Tony sputtered into laughter then, and gripped on his shoulder to balance himself as he swayed. Peter stood with a small smile on his face, because, okay, it was kind of funny. "Kid," Tony said, "that is fucking hilarious. We've got to tell absolutely everyone." Peter's face dropped. "Tony, no!" As much as he could admit it was kind of funny, he didn't want his woes to be told to the whole team, or whoever Tony was planning on telling. "Look, you can't tell the team," Peter shook his head. "At least, not until I've told you what I've got in stock for Clint after the torture he put me through today." "Oh," Tony smirked evilly. "Okay, it's on, Spider-Menace. What have you got planned for Bird Brain?" "Well," Peter grinned and launched into his plan. Yeah, Avengers pranks. They were really on a whole new level of pranking. But Peter's genius plan he had in store to get back at the archer who doubled as a spy, it was going to make the history books.